Hello and welcome to week 4. This week's PowerPoint is really very brief, mainly because the readings I think are very self-explanatory. Many of you have mentioned in your forum postings and in your reaction papers the importance of email to you and to the world in general. And that's the main focus of this week at one level. At another level, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that one of the papers in particular, I'm talking about the Nadi paper, is talking about distributed work requiring mediated communication. So mediated communication basically means communication over a media. So it's any form of communication that's not face-to-face. I don't think they make that absolutely clear in the paper, but that's what it means. In the earlier part of the class, sort of week 1 and week 2, and in my book, we talk about the importance of our group connectedness to us as human beings, and how there is a dichotomy between our need to be individual and the need for connectedness. One of the things that this paper doesn't actually talk about, but I just want to bring to your attention, is that communicating through the mechanisms of email and so forth doesn't necessarily pull us into a group in the same way that talking to somebody in a face-to-face kind of format might tend to. Sometimes that doesn't either, but it's very much more difficult to establish a group-oriented relationship with people. If you have a team, for instance, and all they end up doing is communicating via email, it's very different to if they have met, maybe they've spent 2 or 3 days on a workshop, and then they follow up with email. That's very different. They've already established a certain connectedness and a groupness in the course of the face-to-face communication. So this paper really draws together some of the aspects of email versus what they say crucial activities that relate to face-to-face communication. Just a very brief tale. Many years ago, going back maybe 25 years ago, when British Telecom, which is the sort of British version of what was then AT&T before it was all broken up, in other words, the telephone company, decided they were going to outsource the directory inquiries process. So when you called up for a number that you didn't, in an area where you didn't have the telephone directory, they would find that number for you. They decided to outsource that, not to Bangalore, as might be the case now, but in this case it was to Ireland, to the very, very rural areas of Ireland. And they basically employed people, nearly all women, working at home, and they installed bits of equipment in certain parts of their home, and they would be expected to man the telephones for various hours of the day and take people's directory inquiries. And after a little while, this was a pilot study, they found that people were not really being very diligent with regard to the hours that they worked and that kind of thing. And when they should have been answering the phone, they weren't, and so forth. And they were reporting sort of less satisfaction with what they were doing. Wasn't quite as much fun as they'd hoped. And they were reporting that they were basically getting depressed and cheesed off with their jobs, really. So what British Telecom did was they actually put in small television sets next to the work area for these folks, and then during their scheduled coffee breaks and lunch breaks and that kind of thing, they could, if they wished, have a conversation with video with their counterparts somewhere else. In other words, these folks were not actually working sort of in one large room next to each other where they could peer over the partition and chat to each other, or have the water cooler kind of conversation. So British Telecom put in these video conferencing really facilities to let these ladies actually chat to each other during their coffee breaks and their lunch breaks, and it made a dramatic difference. Within a very short time, people were reporting job satisfaction that had gone way up again. They were sort of checking in at the times they should have been checking in, and basically the whole system was working very well. And that really stuck in my mind because I think with the increasing use of mediated communication, these kinds of issues are becoming much more prevalent, and certainly those people that get involved in team generation, trying to establish teams of people that are geographically distant, they have these kinds of problems a great deal. I want you to bear in mind the extent to which we use electronic mail outside of our own geographical environment, specifically cross-culturally. I used to teach a class on organizational communications at UNR in the business school there. And there were always quite a lot of students from China and Korea and Japan. And it was always very interesting to get them to do a little split the class, and you had the American students write an email, and they would write an email, and basically you were trying to cue them into the fact that they worked for a manufacturer, and they were trying to get the distributor in the foreign country to generate a few more sales, so politely suggests that they needed to kind of step up to the plate, as people sometimes say. So the email part of this process was quite fun, because we might get one of the Asian students to read the email and say, okay, well, precisely what does that mean to you? And you'd get to phrases like "step up to the plate," and of course students that have been in the US quite some time had no difficulty with that. Those that hadn't been there quite so long would often be quite confused as to what that meant. And so, the sports analogy thing, and many other kinds of statements that we make in the normal course of conversation can really get us in trouble in our multicultural world. So I just want you to bear that in mind. Many of you, I know from your Week 1 forum posting, are very much based in not just in the US, but fairly locally. So you're not even really dealing too much with people, communicating with people even the other side of the US, but for some of you that's not the case. But I'd like you just to imagine if you were actually dealing, for instance, with you were assigned to a project where you had to deal with a law enforcement agency in Japan. There was some kind of an international deal going on here where you had to be talking to them, and to the issue of writing the email, even using the abbreviations, which to some extent started with texting and have sort of slipped into the email thing. That all gets into big trouble if we're dealing on a cross-cultural kind of basis. So the Brennan O'Heary paper is very much along the same lines, isn't it? We're looking here at why email communications can often seem very polite. I'm sure we've all experienced that. Even if we know the person, we had this email and it just seemed out of character. And then when you talk to them, you realize that was simply a function of the communication means. They were running out of the office, they saw your email, they thought, oh, must get back to him. They had literally sort of 25 seconds to get it up there, to type the message, to hit send, gather up their bits and pieces and leave. That kind of brevity on its own can be a problem. But in this paper we look at something which is a little bit more in-depth than that. We look at issues of hedging, whereby if we're not absolutely sure of something on a face-to-face communication, our antenna can be out, we can be looking at the other person to see there's a quizzical tone to the communication that we put out, and we want to see if there's agreement the other side or not, as opposed to sort of saying, this is what I think. This is a much more kind of tentative process, and it's all part of the process that we put out if we don't want to seem to be kind of bombastic and opinionated. We have these intonations of voice and various other techniques, which of course we can't really do with the email process. So in conclusion then, these papers are looking at various issues related to mediated communication, and obviously for us that's generally speaking email, but not exclusively, of course. These things occur also even in the written word in terms of websites. People can make certain assumptions with regard to how websites are going to be read and used, and they're not necessarily accurate. But focusing on the immediate processes involved in email, I hope you find them interesting. Many of it will be very obvious, and it's not really an in-depth learning experience. It's really to focus your attention on the fact that when you send an email, you're not necessarily conveying the message that you hope you are, and this I hope will open your eyes as to why that may not be the case. Bear in mind also, many of you are quite a way up the ladder in your professions, and from time to time you get to be sending out memos, probably quite regularly. So it would be interesting if you reflected on that. That might be kind of something interesting to read in the forum. Because in a memo you're not really answering anybody's question, you're specifically trying to communicate to quite a broad range of people. I'm sure your colleagues, your subordinates are not all from exactly the same social environment that you are. So you've got some cross-cultural communicating to be done there. And so memos are yet another rather intriguing form of communication that is also very, very subject to misunderstanding, and needs, of course, to be sort of very much more diligent in some ways than just a casual email to somebody that you know, because one of these memo is really something that people pay quite a bit of attention to, and they may read it 2 or 3 times to make sure they understand it and to look for any nuances they might have missed. So it would be interesting to know. I bet you there are 2 or 3 examples that will come forward of people who sent out memos that were misunderstood, or received memos that had a meaning that was totally different to the one that they were intended for. So anyway, enjoy the readings.